Section 9 of Beacon Lights of History, Volume 4, Imperial Antiquity, by John Lord. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by K. Hand. Paula, Part 1. A.D. 347 to 404. Woman as Friend. The subject of this lecture is Paula, an illustrious Roman lady of rank and wealth, whose remarkable friendship for Saint Jerome in the latter part of the 4th century has made her historical. If to her we do not date the first great change in the social relations of man with woman, yet she is the most memorable example that I can find of that exalted sentiment which Christianity called out in the intercourse of the sexes, and which has done more for the elevation of society than any other sentiment except that of religion itself. Female friendship, however, must ever have adorned and cheered the world. It naturally springs from the depths of a woman's soul. However dark and dismal society may have been under the withering influences of paganism, it is probable that glorious instances could be chronicled of the devotion of woman to man and of man to woman, which was not intensified by the passion of love. Nevertheless, the condition of women in the pagan world, even with all the influences of civilization, was unfavorable to that sentiment which is such a charm in social life. The pagan woman belonged to her husband or father rather than to herself. As more fully shown in the discussion of Cleopatra, she was universally regarded as inferior to man and made to be his slave. She was miserably educated, she was secluded from intercourse with strangers, she was shut up in her home, she was given in marriage without her consent, she was guarded by female slaves. She was valued chiefly as a domestic servant, or as an animal to prevent the extinction of families. She was seldom honored. She was doomed to household drudgeries as if she were capable of nothing higher. In short, her lot was hard because it was unequal, humiliating, and sometimes degrading, making her to be either timorous, frivolous, or artful. Her amusements were trivial, her taste vitiated, her education neglected, her rights violated, her aspirations scorned. The poets represented her as capricious, fickle, and false. She rose only to fall, she lived only to die. She was a victim, a toy, or a slave. Bedizened or burdened, she was either an object of degrading admiration or of cold neglect. The Jewish women seem to have been more favored and honored than women were in Greece or Rome, even in the highest periods of their civilization. But in Jewish history woman was the coy maiden, or the vigilant housekeeper, or the ambitious mother, or the intriguing wife, or the obedient daughter, or the patriotic songstress, rather than the sympathetic friend. Though we admire the beautiful Rachel, or the heroic Deborah, or the virtuous Abigail, or the affectionate Ruth, or the fortunate Esther, or the brave Judith, or the generous Shunammite, we do not find in the Rachels and Esthers the hallowed ministrations of the Marys, the Marthas, and the Phoebes, until Christianity had developed the virtues of the heart and kindled the loftier sentiments of the soul. Then woman became not merely the gentle nurse and the prudent housewife and the disinterested lover, but a friend, an angel of consolation, the equal of man in character, and his superior in the virtues of the heart and soul. It was not till then that she was seen to have those qualities which extort veneration, and call out the deepest sympathy, whenever life is divested of its demoralizing egotisms. The original beatitudes of the Garden of Eden returned, and man awoke from the deep sleep of 4,000 years to discover with Adam that woman was a partner for whom he should resign all the other attachments of life, and she became his star of worship and his guardian angel amid the entanglements of sin and cares of toil. I would not assert that there were not noble exceptions to the frivolities and slaveries to which women were generally doomed in pagan Greece and Rome. Paganism records the fascinations of famous women who could allure the greatest statesmen and the wisest moralists to their charmed circle of admirers, of women who united high intellectual culture with physical beauty. It tells us of Artemisia, who erected to her husband a mausoleum which was one of the wonders of the world; of Telesilla, the poetess, who saved Argos by her courage; of Hipparchia, who married a deformed and ugly cynic, in order that she might make attainments in learning and philosophy; of Fantasia, who wrote a poem on the Trojan War, which Homer himself did not disdain to utilize; of Sappho, who invented a new measure in lyric poetry, and who was so highly esteemed that her countrymen stamped their money with her image; of Volumnia screening Rome from the vengeance of her angry son; of Servilia parting with her jewels to secure her father's liberty; of Sulpicia, who fled from the luxuries of Rome to be a partner of the exile of her husband; of Hortensia pleading for justice before the triumvirs in the market place; of Octavia protecting the children of her rival Cleopatra; of Lucretia destroying herself rather than survive the dishonor of her house; of Cornelia inciting her sons, the Gracchi, to deeds of patriotism, and many other illustrious women. We read of courage, fortitude, patriotism, conjugal and parental love. But how seldom do we read of those who were capable of an exalted friendship for men, without provoking scandal or exciting rude suspicion? Who among the poets paint friendship without love? Who among them extol women, unless they couple with their praises of mental and moral qualities a mention of the delights of sensual charms and of the joys of wine and banquets? Poets represent the sentiments of an age or people, and the poets of Greece and Rome have almost libelled humanity itself by their bitter sarcasms, showing how degraded the condition of woman was under pagan influences. Now I select Paula, to show that friendship, the noblest sentiment in woman, was not common until Christianity had greatly modified the opinions and habits of society, and to illustrate how indissolubly connected this noble sentiment is with the highest triumphs of an emancipating religion. Paula was a highly favored as well as highly gifted woman. She was a descendant of the Scipios and the Gracchi, and was born A.D. 347 at Rome, 10 years after the death of the great Constantine, who enthroned Christianity, but while yet the social forces of the empire were entangled in the meshes of paganism. She was married at 17 to Toxotius, of the still more illustrious Julian family. She lived on Mount Aventine in great magnificence. She owned, it is said, a whole city in Italy. She was one of the richest women of antiquity, and belonged to the very highest rank of society in an aristocratic age. Until her husband died, she was not distinguished from other Roman ladies of rank, except for the splendor of her palace and the elegance of her life. It seems that she was first won to Christianity by the virtues of the celebrated Marcella, and she hastened to enroll herself, with her 5 daughters, as pupils of this learned woman, at the same time giving up those habits of luxury which thus far had characterized her, together with most ladies of her class. On her conversion, she distributed to the poor the quarter part of her immense income, charity being one of the forms which religion took in the early ages of Christianity. Nor was she contented to part with the splendor of her ordinary life. She became a nurse of the miserable and the sick, and when they died she buried them at her own expense. She sought out and relieved distress wherever it was to be found. But her piety could not escape the asceticism of the age. She lived on bread and a little oil, wasted her body with fastings, dressed like a servant, slept on a mat of straw, covered herself with haircloth, and denied herself the pleasures to which she had been accustomed. She would not even take a bath. The Catholic historians have unduly magnified these virtues, but it was the type which piety then assumed, arising in part from a too literal interpretation of the injunctions of Christ. We are more enlightened in these times, since modern Christian civilization seeks to solve the problem how far the pleasures of this world may be reconciled with the pleasures of the world to come. But the Christians of the 4th century were more austere, like the original Puritans, and made but little account of pleasures which weaned them from the contemplation of God and divine truth, and chained them to the triumphal car of a material and infidel philosophy. As the great and besetting sin of the Jews before the captivity was idolatry, which thus was the principal subject of rebuke from the messengers of omnipotence, the one thing which the Jews were warned to avoid, as hypocrisy and Pharisaism and a technical and legal piety were the greatest vices to be avoided when Christ began his teachings, so Epicureanism in life and philosophy was the greatest evil with which the early Christians had to contend, and which the more eminent among them sought to shun, like Athanasius, Basil, and Chrysostom. The asceticism of the early Church was simply the protest against that materialism which was undermining society and preparing the way to ruin. And hence the loftiest type of piety assumed the form of deadly antagonism to the luxuries and self indulgence which pervaded every city of the empire. This antagonism may have been carried too far, even as the Puritan made war on many innocent pleasures. But the spectacle of a self indulgent and pleasure seeking Christian was abhorrent to the piety of those saints who controlled the opinions of the Christian world. The world was full of misery and poverty, and it was these evils they sought to relieve. The leaders of pagan society were abandoned to gains and pleasures, which the Christians would fain rebuke by a lofty self denial, even as Stoicism, the noblest remonstrance of the pagan intellect, had its greatest example in an illustrious Roman emperor, who vainly sought to stem the vices which he saw were preparing the way for the conquests of the barbarians. The historian who does not take cognizance of the great necessities of nations, and of the remedies with which good men seek to meet these necessities, is neither philosophical nor just. And instead of railing at the saints, so justly venerated and powerful, because they were austere and ascetic, he should remember that only an indifference to the pleasures and luxuries which were the fatal evils of their day could make a powerful impression even on the masses, and make Christianity stand out in bold contrast with the fashionable, perverse, and false doctrines which paganism endorsed. And I venture to predict that if the increasing and unblushing materialism of our times shall at last call for such scathing rebukes as the Jewish prophets launched against the sin of idolatry, or such as Christ himself employed when he exposed the hollowness of the piety of the men who took the lead in religious instruction in his day, then the loftiest characters, those whose example is most revered, will again disdain and shun a style of life which seriously conflicts with the triumphs of a spiritual Christianity. Paula was an ascetic Roman matron on her conversion, or else her conversion would then have seemed nominal. But her nature was not austere. She was a woman of great humanity, and distinguished for those generous traits which have endeared Augustine to the heart of the world. Her hospitalities were boundless. Her palace was the resort of all who were famous, when they visited the great capital of the empire. Nor did her asceticism extinguish the natural affections of her heart. When one of her daughters died, her grief was as immoderate as that of Bernard on the loss of his brother. The woman was never lost in the saint. Another interesting circumstance was her enjoyment of cultivated society, and even of those literary treasures which imperishable art had bequeathed. She spoke the Greek language as an English or Russian nobleman speaks French, as a theological student understands German. Her companions were gifted and learned women. Intimately associated with her in Christian labors was Marcella, a lady who refused the hand of the reigning consul, and yet, in spite of her duties as a leader of Christian benevolence, so learned that she could explain intricate passages of the Scriptures, versed equally in Greek and Hebrew, and so revered that when Rome was taken by the Goths, her splendid palace on Mount Aventine was left unmolested by the barbaric spoliators. Paula was also the friend and companion of Albina and Marcellina, sisters of the great Ambrose, whose father was governor of Gaul. Felicita, Principia, and Feliciana also belonged to her circle, all of noble birth and great possessions. Her own daughter, Blessella, was married to a descendant of Camillus, and even the illustrious Fabiola, whose life is so charmingly portrayed by Cardinal Wiseman, was also a member of this chosen circle. It was when Rome was the field of her charities and the scene of her virtues, when she equally blazed as a queen of society and a saint of the most self-sacrificing duties, that Paula fell under the influence of Saint Jerome, at that time secretary of Pope Damasus, the most austere and the most learned man of Christian antiquity. The great oracle of the Latin Church, sharing with Augustine the reverence bestowed by succeeding ages, whose translation of the Scriptures into Latin has made him an immortal benefactor. Nor was Jerome a plebeian. He was a man of rank and fortune, like the more famous of the Fathers, but gave away his possessions to the poor, as did so many others of his day. Nothing had been spared on his education by his wealthy Illyrian parents. At 18 he was sent to Rome to complete his studies. He became deeply imbued with classic literature, and was more interested in the great authors of Greece and Rome than in the material glories of the empire. He lived in their ideas so completely that in after times his acquaintance with even the writings of Cicero was a matter of self-reproach. Disgusted, however, with the pomps and vanities around him, he sought peace in the consolations of Christianity. His ardent nature impelled him to embrace the ascetic doctrines which were so highly esteemed and venerated. He buried himself in the catacombs, and lived like a monk. Then his inquiring nature compelled him to travel for knowledge, and he visited whatever was interesting in Italy, Greece, and Asia Minor, and especially Palestine, finally fixing upon Chalcius, on the confines of Syria, as his abode. There he gave himself up to contemplation and study, and to the writing of letters to all parts of Christendom. These letters and his learned treatises, and especially the fame of his sanctity, excited so much interest that Pope Damasus summoned him back to Rome to become his counselor and secretary. More austere than Bossuet or Fénelon at the court of Louis XIV., he was as accomplished and even more learned than they. They were courtiers; he was a spiritual dictator, ruling, not like Dunstan, by an appeal to superstitious fears, but by learning and sanctity. In his coarse garments he maintained his equality with princes and nobles. To the great he appeared proud and repulsive; to the poor he was affable, gentle, and sympathetic. They thought him as humble as the rich thought him arrogant. Such a man, so learned and pious, so courtly in his manners, so eloquent in his teachings, so independent and fearless in his spirit, so brilliant in conversation, although tinged with bitterness and sarcasm, became a favorite in those high circles where rank was adorned by piety and culture. The spiritual director became a friend, and his friendship was especially valued by Paula and her illustrious circle. Among those brilliant and religious women he was at home, for by birth and education he was their equal. At the house of Paula he was like Whitfield at the Countess of Huntingdon's, or Michelangelo at the palace of Vittoria Colonna, a friend, a teacher, and an oracle. So in the midst of a chosen and favored circle did Jerome live, with the bishops and the doctors who equally sought the exalted privilege of its courtesies and its kindness. And the friendship, based on sympathy with Christian labors, became strengthened every day by mutual appreciation, and by that frank and genial intercourse which can exist only with cultivated and honest people. Those high-born ladies listened to his teachings with enthusiasm, entered into all his schemes, and gave him most generous co-operation. Not because his literary successes had been blazed throughout the world, but because, like them, he concealed under his coarse garments and his austere habits an ardent, earnest, eloquent soul, with intense longings after truth, and with noble aspirations to extend that religion which was the only hope of the decaying empire. Like them, he had a boundless contempt for empty and passing pleasures, for all the plaudits of the devotees to fashion, and he appreciated their trials and temptations, and pointed out, with more than fraternal tenderness, those insidious enemies that came in the disguise of angels of light. Only a man of his intuitions could have understood the disinterested generosity of those noble women, and the passionless serenity with which they contemplated the demons they had by grace exorcised. And it was only they, with their more delicate organization and their innate insight, who could have entered upon his sorrows, and penetrated the secrets he did not seek to reveal. He gave to them his choicest hours, explained to them the mysteries, revealed his own experiences, animated their hopes, removed their stumbling blocks, encouraged them in missions of charity, ignored their mistakes, gloried in their sacrifices, and held out to them the promised joys of the endless future. In return they consoled him in disappointment, shared his resentments, exulted in his triumphs, soothed him in his toils, administered to his wants, guarded his infirmities, relieved him from irksome details, and inspired him to exalted labors by increasing his self-respect. Not with empty flatteries, nor idle dalliances, nor frivolous arts, did they mutually encourage and assist each other. Sincerity and truthfulness were the first conditions of their holy intercourse, the communion of saints, in which they believed, the sympathies of earth purified by the aspirations of heaven, and neither he nor they were ashamed to feel that such a friendship was more precious than rubies, being sanctioned by apostles and martyrs, nay, without which a Bethany would have been as dreary as the stalls and tables of money changers in the precincts of the temple. A mere worldly life could not have produced such a friendship, for it would have been ostentatious, or prodigal, or vain, allied with sumptuous banquets, with intellectual tournaments, with selfish aims, with foolish presents, with emotions which degenerate into passions. Ennui, disappointment, burdensome obligation, ultimate disgust, are the result of what is based on the finite and worldly, allied with the gifts which come from a selfish heart, with the urbanities which are equally showered on the evil and on the good, with the graces which sometimes conceal the poison of asps. How unsatisfactory and mournful the friendship between Voltaire and Frederick the Great, with all their brilliant qualities and mutual flatteries! How unmeaning would have been a friendship between Chesterfield and Dr. Johnson, even had the latter stooped to all the arts of sycophancy! The world can only inspire its votaries with its own idolatries. Whatever is born of vanity will end in vanity. Even in laughter the heart is sorrowful, and the end of that mirth is heaviness. But when we seek in friends that which can perpetually refresh and never satiate, the counsel which maketh wise, the voice of truth and not the voice of flattery, that which will instruct and never degrade, the influences which banish envy and mistrust, then there is a precious life in it which survives all change. In the atmosphere of admiration, respect, and sympathy, suspicion dies, and base desires pass away for lack of their accustomed nourishment. We see defects through the glass of our own charity, with the eyes of love and pity, while all that is beautiful is rendered radiant; a halo surrounds the mortal form, like the glory which mediaeval artists aspired to paint in the faces of Madonnas; and adoration succeeds to sympathy, since the excellences we admire are akin to the perfections we adore. The occult elements and latent affinities, of which material pursuits never take cognizance, are influences as potent in adding a charm to labor or repose as dew or air in the natural world, in giving a tint to flowers or sap to vegetation. In that charmed circle, in which it would be difficult to say whether Jerome or Paula presided, the aesthetic mission of woman was seen fully, perhaps for the first time, which is never recognized when love of admiration, or intellectual hardihood, or frivolous employments, or usurped prerogatives blunt original sensibilities and sap the elements of inward life. Sentiment proved its superiority over all the claims of intellect, as when Flora Macdonald effected the escape of Charles Stuart after the fatal battles of Culloden, or when Mary poured the spikenard on Jesus' head and wiped his feet with the hairs of her head. The glory of the mind yielded to the superior radiance of an admiring soul, and equals stood out in each other's eyes as gifted superiors whom it was no sin to venerate. Radiant in the innocence of conscious virtue, capable of appreciating any flights of genius, holding their riches of no account except to feed the hungry and clothe the naked, these friends lived only to repair the evils which unbridled sin inflicted on mankind, glorious examples of the support which our frail nature needs, the sun and joy of social life, perpetual benedictions, the sweet rest of a harassed soul. Strange it is that such a friendship was found in the most corrupt, conventional, luxurious city of the empire. It is not in cities that friendships are supposed to thrive. People in great towns are too preoccupied, too busy, too distracted to shine in those amenities which require peace and rest and leisure. Bacon quotes the Latin adage, "Magna civitas, magna solitudo." It is in cities where real solitude dwells, since friends are scattered, and crowds are not company, and faces are only as a gallery of pictures, and talk but a tinkling cymbal, where there is no love. The history of Jerome and Paula suggests another reflection, that the friendship which would have immortalized them, had they not other and higher claims to the remembrance and gratitude of mankind, rarely exists except with equals. There must be sympathy in the outward relations of life, as we are constituted, in order for men and women to understand each other. Friendship is not philanthropy. It is a refined and subtle sentiment which binds hearts together in similar labors and experiences. It must be confessed it is exclusive, esoteric, a sort of moral freemasonry. Jerome and the great bishops and the illustrious ladies to whom I allude, all belonged to the same social ranks. They spent their leisure hours together, read the same books, and kindled at the same sentiments. In their charmed circle they unbent, indulged perchance in ironical sallies on the follies they alike despised. They freed their minds as Cicero did to Atticus. They said things to each other which they might have hesitated to say in public, or among fools and dunces. I can conceive that those austere people were sometimes even merry and jocose. The ignorant would not have understood their learned allusions; the narrow-minded might have been shocked at the treatment of their shibboleths; the vulgar would have repelled them by the coarseness; the sensual would have disgusted them by their lower tastes. There can be no true harmony among friends when their sensibilities are shocked, or their views are discrepant. How could Jerome or Paula have discoursed with enthusiasm of the fascinations of Eastern travel to those who had no desire to see the sacred places, or of charms of Grecian literature to those who could only talk in Latin, or of the corrupting music of the poets to people of perverted taste, or of the sublimity of the Hebrew prophets to those who despised the Jews, or of the luxury of charity to those who had no superfluities, or of the beatitudes of the passive virtues to soldiers, or of the mysteries of faith to speculating rationalists, or of the greatness of the infinite to those who lived in passing events? A Jewish prophet must have seemed a rhapsodist to Athenian critics, and a Grecian philosopher a conceited cynic to a converted fisherman of Galilee, even as a boastful Darwinite would be repulsive to a believer in the active interference of the moral governor of the universe. Even Luther might not have admired Michael Angelo any more than the great artist did the courtiers of Julius II, and John Knox might have denounced Lord Bacon as a Gallio for advocating moderate measures of reform. The courtly Bossuet would not probably have sympathized with Baxter, even when both discoursed on the eternal gulf between reason and faith. Jesus, the wandering, weary man of sorrows, loved Mary and Martha and Lazarus. But Jesus, in the hour of supreme grief, allowed the most spiritual and intellectual of his disciples to lean on his bosom. It was the son of a king whom David cherished with a love surpassing the love of woman. It was to Plato that Socrates communicated his moral wisdom. It was with cultivated youth that Augustine surrounded himself in the gardens of Como. Caesar walked with Antony, and Cassius with Brutus. It was to Madame de Maintenon that Fenelon poured out the riches of his intellect, and the lofty Saint Cyrian opened to Mère Angélique the sorrows of his soul. We associate Aspasia with Pericles, Cicero with Atticus, Héloïse with Abélard, Hildebrand with the Countess Matilda, Michael Angelo with Vittoria Colonna, Cardinal de Retz with the Duchess de Longueville, Dr. Johnson with Hannah More. End of section 9.